Welcome to Understanding the Mental Health Crisis Among Men and Fathers. We all know, if we haven't experienced it yet, that becoming a parent is a life-changing event. And what we bring to that role of parent can include mental health problems for both the men who become fathers and the women who become mothers, or the men who become nurturing and the mothers who become disciplinarians. However, there is limited research on the issue of mental health problems for men that sentence didn't come out right. However, there is limited research regarding this issue, particularly for fathers. In this session, we will provide an overview of mental health issues that fathers may face. We will discuss risk factors, symptoms, and social determinants of mental health that explain the high prevalence of various disorders among men and fathers. These include suicidality, substance abuse disorders, and other problems that can interfere with your ability to have the quality and tone of relationship that you want and have dreamed of with your child. We have 4 experts who will describe what we know or, think we know, and the knowledge gaps that must be addressed. I am Janice Stevenson. I'm a psychologist located in Columbia, Maryland, and I serve the Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, D.C. zone. I specialize in trauma psychology, and I've been doing this for like 40-something years. So if I sound like I'm tired, it's because I've earned it. Our next member of our panel is Mac Hamlet.
Hi, I'm Mac Hammett. I've been in private practice mental health counseling since 1993, and I've been focusing on men and men's issues. I, along with 6 other people, started a program called Father to Father, where we worked with men who did not have custody of their children and were often behind in their child support payments, to try to help them deal with those issues to get reconnected as fathers to their families. So my whole practice for 30 years has been working with fathers who have been estranged from their families and who are just trying to figure out who they are as men and how to best equip themselves to live a full life in the honorable role of fatherhood and being an authentic man.
Thank you. Derek, can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Gordon. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I live and work in the greater New Haven area in Connecticut. My work is a little bit of a mix. I consider myself a clinical community psychologist, in that I like to think about how we bring what we know in the science of psychology to the community that would be applied in real world settings. And one of the areas I work in is in this intersection between mental health and public health, and thinking about how do we support men who are on the fringes be more engaged in family and community life. And a key role in that is how do we work with fathers. And so that's a little bit about who I am.
Thank you. Jerome, and by the way, I'm going to start referring to the members of my panel as doctors, because, they got that and we've earned it and it's nice. Okay. Dr. Mosby.
Yes, greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Jerome Maltsby, and I'm a psychologist for practice, and also I am a master life coach, as well as a certified male perpetrator of domestic violence, family violence. I've been working with men for quite a few years in this idea about intervention and growth and re-identifying manhood. But I think this conversation, I know this conversation is very prevalent that we're having today. I'm excited about being here and this open discussion about the fact that we all have the ability to change our mind, change our mindset, and to be our best selves.
Thank you. I'm going to throw one more question to the panel as part of the introduction. And this is just a one-sentence question, which is, what would you like to make sure the participants in this panel hear and learn from the totality of our discussion? in one sentence, could you say what you would like to make sure people take away from what we offer, especially yourself? Jerome,
I
could you
think
start that?
I think the
Or Mac.
or Mac, I can't hear you. I think I would like everyone to just rethink the whole process of listening and how critical it is to men who very rarely have anyone who truly hears their story.
Very good. Derek?
As I think about this, I guess the larger takeaway for me is more so this panel kind of actually kind of encapsulates it, which is the recognizing that men's mental health is important and is important for family and community health. And so let's begin to kind of have that be a part of the conversation.
And Jerome?
Yes, I agree with my colleagues. And also, I would hope that men that participate in this process will allow themselves to re-identify what manhood is and dispel the myths, dispel how we've been socialized, and the misinformation about what manhood is. And so that I believe that re-identification.
Thank you. And I personally would like to see the audience in this panel take away a valuing of who they are as males, who started as boys, who were the most loving characters, the most amazingly sensitive creatures, who adored their moms and worshiped their dads and really valued their siblings. And whether that was welcomed in the family or not, the boys who were young were soft and sensitive, and the men grew up and kind of put that aside because of societal messages, because of peer messages, and stopped valuing that soft and gentle part of themselves. And that's the part that sometimes gets wounded and comes into our offices for help. So I would like people to take away from this the value that they bring for the fullness of who they are. And we hope that you get those benefits from this workshop, from this panel today. I have a series of questions that I would like to ask the panel. We can take them one at a time. I'm going to call in random order, so don't get used to responding in the same order that you have before, just to mess up with Mac over here. So the first question that I want to ask the panel is, why are men's and fathers' mental health and behavioral health issues referred to as a silent crisis? And I'm going to start with Jerome. Can you tell us why it's referred to as what a silent crisis is?
Well, from my experience with the men that I work with currently in the past, is the silence is the how they see themselves, and the idea that it's embarrassing. To your point, Dr. Stevens, about emotions, it's that they identify themselves as being strong, tough, and willing to suppress their innermost feelings about any given situation they experience. So that in that silence is a denial of that they actually can be hurt and identify what the hurt really is. And so I believe that silence is suppressing our innermost feelings.
Got it. And Derek, could you speak to why men's mental health and behavioral health issues are referred to? Mental health issues.
You know, Dr. Stevenson, when I think about these, this question, the silence to me has, you know, how it resonates for me is around this idea of not being spoken of. I think when we think about men's behavioral and mental health issues, you know, Dr. Mosley talked about the folks not being heard. But I also think that there is an issue around they're not being actually voiced. You know, those concerns are not being voiced. And so how do we lift that up? How do we kind of make that a part of the conversation? Because if we don't talk about it, it has a way of metastasizing and showing itself up in ways that we don't want to see it show up. And so I think that there's a way in which, you know, the silence kind of we have to break this cycle of the silence and kind of lend voice to it and help men recognize that they're not alone in this experience. And so I think that's why it becomes this issue of kind of the silent crisis that's happening, because I think that it's kind of percolating just on the surface, and sometimes it's ignored, although we have the signs and symptoms right in front of us very regularly.
Mac, can you add something to that from your experience?
I've been asking my men since I've been asked to speak on this topic. I've been asking my male clients, why don't men come to therapy? And the overwhelming answer is because we're stubborn. And my family physician says, men don't go to the doctor until they have a heart attack. My dentist says, men don't go to the dentist until their teeth start falling out. So men think they've got the answers, or at least they've been culturally indoctrinated that they're supposed to have an answer to all of their problems and questions and cures. So the last thing that a man really wants to do is ask for help. And that's to ask for mental health help is just one level higher. I think men sometimes would rather have a heart attack than go see a mental health therapist for their problems. 49% men make up 49% of American population, but 80% of suicides are men. So there are a lot of hurting men that are not reaching out for help, and they need help.
They're hurting silently.
Yes.
Derek, you wanted to add? Not Derek. Jerome, you wanted to add something?
Yes, one other point that I know that we all are fully aware of the stigma that's behind mental health. And that is across the board, across cultures, it's a stigma. And in the African-American community, I think from my experience, it's a very prominent stigma about what mental health is. And so there is a keen denial about not wanting to find anything towards the idea that I have.
If I could
Powerful point, Derek.
If I could just piggyback off of that idea of the stigma that's associated with that, I think even embedded in that is the way in which, if I were to acknowledge that there is a mental health challenge that's going on, the way in which, and you kind of alluded to it, Dr. Stevenson, earlier, or the way in which I was socialized into how men are supposed to operate and behave and function, I shouldn't allow myself to step into that space to acknowledge that this thing is happening to me, and if it is, I should have the answers singularly, me. And so kind of putting that pressure on you to be able to kind of solve something that is maybe bigger than you or beyond you, and it leaves you feeling a bit isolated, because if I'm supposed to fix it for myself, then there's no room for me to reach out to others and say, hey, I'm experiencing this, and these are the challenges that I'm encountering. Can you help me figure out how to kind of navigate through this? So I think, that whole piece around the stigma, I think is very important. And I think that there's a way in which it ties into the ways in which we've been socialized as men to feel as if we have to go this alone, and we should have the access to this, the answers to this singularly.
And I would add to that, that men should be able to handle both the scariest parts of it and the most overwhelming parts of it, whether they have language for it or not, whether they have socialization for it or not, whether they were dismissed watching men not handle funerals in the family, for example, or not handle honoring their wives or their daughters as they were growing up. The men are still expected to rise above and just function tremendously. I do get weary of hearing men, and I work a lot in prisons, including death row, and I do get tired of hearing men say that this is the first time anyone's ever listened to me, or that I don't think I know how to say that because nobody ever taught me words for that. There are too many men who come into sessions not having cried publicly or even with close family members when significant people in their world died, or when they were heartbroken in relationships. Because if they do, they can't go to their fraternity brothers, they can't go to the members of their church ministry, they can't even go to their male cousins and brothers, because they will be ridiculed. They will be, and it's a vicious form of bullying. They will be taunted for being weak or for being labeled in all kind of derogatory ways. So that silence is actually crushing the male spirit on a daily basis. And it takes them much longer in therapy to trust the therapist. I don't know about you guys, you can let me know, especially Mac, because of the range of experience he's had in working with men. It takes me longer to gain trust and safety in establishing the relationship with a man than it does with a woman who is more socialized to the full array of emotions.
Right.
Dr. Stevenson, the thing that I want to kind of highlight in there is a recognition that, if there's this perception that men are supposed to be able to step into a space and be able to figure stuff out on their own, when they can't, it's like none of us got up and could drive a car automatically. We have to learn some basic skills, and so in that way, there's a little bit of a disadvantage if you expected to kind of be able to jump into a semi truck and drive on the highway. None of us have those skills. They're learned skills. And so begin to think about how we kind of move away from that. And I would say that in my work with men, I do agree with you. It does take them a little bit longer to kind of build that relationship. And there's sometimes challenge with figuring out how to be in a caring relationship with another man, because there are all sorts of issues that show up. And so one of the things that I like to, I can be a bit provocative in my therapeutic encounters with folks. And so one of the things that I say to men oftentimes coming into therapy is like, when you come into therapy, it's like you coming in, getting butt naked, and the person across from you has all their clothes on. And kind of talking about the discomfort that shows up in that space and what it means and what it conjures up for them. And then saying, but guess what? I'm here to be supportive of you in this work and help you figure out where you want to go and maybe teach some skills in the context of the work. And so again, helping folks begin to identify and unpack what the challenges are to building this relationship that we're trying to work on together in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. I would also agree that, men come in with a narrative. They come with a narrative that's developed not just in the present time, but also how they've been socialized. One of the things that we talk about is, well, who taught you how to be a man? Where did you learn? We don't, that's to your point, Dr. Gordon, we don't come into this world knowing how to be a man. And so definitely our psychosocial environment has a great impact on the people we see in the present time. And so knowing that based on that narrative is a major part of that is just how I behave, how I see myself as a man. And so now to re-identify, to really get to know the innermost thought process that they're having about how they see themselves. Important. And so in that way, we talked about earlier about, so therefore, if there's that stigma, then I'm operating out of that stigma, how I define it. So when I show up, I'm going to have issues based on me re-identify myself something other than how I see myself right now, how I've been social. And if you talk about behavior and mental health, there is going to be a rejection of that based on maybe cultural, just so many different derivatives that we're faced with of the unknown. So it's important for us to build that rapport, to build that trust, because when a man trusts you, they're more likely to be vulnerable.
So I think it's important to move mental health from crisis intervention to positive empowerment. And most of the men that we see are in the middle of crisis when they come to therapy. But if we can just hang in there with them long enough, we can help them understand the value of therapy is to empower them, to help them realize their potential and, to have a fullness of happiness and not just see mental health as where you go when you're in the middle of crisis. I'd love to see men before they get to a crisis. I think that would be the real value we have to offer.
and have them come where they're the ones initiating, say, couples therapy or family therapy, as opposed to being dragged,
Yes.
kicking and screaming, and don't think I'm going to open my mouth when I get in there, but I'm going to do this to shut you up right now. Yes,
Right.
I agree.
Yes.
The next question we can tackle is, what are the top challenges that you see most with the men and fathers that you work with? Jerome, you want to start that?
Yes, sure. As with you and Mac, I have the opportunity to go inside jails and prisons, and so I find that in that they made conscious decisions to break the law, in some form of fashion, and while they're inside, they're not getting the intervention early, so that when they come out, they have a starting block. So that's the challenge. Folks who have been incarcerated for long periods of time, in particularly where they're institutionalized. There's a huge mental block on that, the idea about that manhood. So I find that that's a major challenge in my work, is working with men that have been incarcerated. What I do know and I share with them is that before the bar showed up, you were actually incarcerated in your thinking process. And to help identify that it wasn't the bars that now identify, but what your thoughts were and what got you there, an issue. But let's address your thoughts, your thinking, and that's a great place I find to start. Help to realize that there's a deeper issue in the experience. I talk more about the cause versus the effect. And I believe that whole idea about cause and effect helps them re-identify what's going on with their thought process.
Mac, what are the top challenges you see?
I think men don't have the language of therapy. So what I mean by that is they don't have the vernacular of feeling words. We don't have models when we're children. Our fathers don't teach us about feeling words, and we end up only having just 3 or 4 words, one of them being anger. But we don't have all of the other kinds of language to express ourselves. So we tend to be more active in our expression of our feelings than we are verbal. And that's a huge obstacle in, I think, the therapeutic path, because then you got to sit down and try to communicate with somebody that doesn't even speak the language that you're trying to talk with them through. So you got to teach them words. Men don't even have the words for feelings. That's a huge obstacle I see all the time. And then there are all of the expectations that men are not supposed to talk about their feelings anyway. They're just supposed to solve them or wait it out or pretend that everything's okay. But language is a very difficult part of therapy.
Kind of building off of that, this idea of kind of language, I sometimes feel as if there's a struggle, because I think oftentimes men feel as if their menu of choices around emotions are 2, anger or happiness, and there's nothing in between those 2 things. And oftentimes, kind of building on what you just shared, Mac, I feel as if part of what I have to, in working with men, is have them recognize that one doesn't always feel just one thing, just that. I might be angry, but I might also be sad. I might also be hurt. I might also be disappointed, and kind of thinking about how do all those things happen in one basket is just kind of unfathomable, because folks have this idea that there's that whole piece. And then attached to that is this idea of shame. So I did something happened to me, or I experienced something, and there's a shame response that's attached to that thing, and therefore I can't talk about it. I recently had a therapeutic encounter with someone over Zoom, and the thing that they needed to talk to me about, they couldn't voice. So they were literally typing what it is that was going on for them. And they didn't want to say it out loud. And so we talked about that being the first step to kind of actually confronting it. I'm glad that you were able to physically type it out, so I know what it is that was going on. The next step is, how do we then talk about it? How do we then deal with the shame that's attached to all what you're encountering? And so just thinking about how these pieces might show up. And I think that's when you talk about the what's the issue that's there the most is men kind of being able to manage those kind of things that Matt talked about, but also then thinking about feeling, I'm going to say, some kind of way when the emotions come flooding out and they have no control over these emotions. And here I am as another man there to be in that space with them and what that means too. So I'll just stop kind of there, but just wanted to highlight those pieces.
Yes, I also do.
I want to add.
I'm sorry.
Go on, Dr. Mosley.
No, and I agree with both men that about what I would give a word to that would be fear. There are fear-based entities about manhood that men fight against. I don't want to seem to be fearful. I'm not going to show that part of myself, but I'm actually afraid. That fear, their insecurities, there's an inability to express themselves and their feelings, and to really re-identify the fact that if I'm going to see where my challenges are, I have to go beyond the fear of how I look and how I'm seen. And so that's, family, with friends, that was mentioned earlier about 30s and all how I socialize. I will not demonstrate that fear. So then what happens? Asking. So for us to get to unmask them in that fear-based mentality, those insecurities, that low level of energy, like I talk about, I say, I would rather you be angry than insecure. I can work with you as you're angry. That's an energy that I can work with. But insecurity and all those things, that's a deeper dive into that person's and their emotions. So I do believe that one of the things I've identified is there's a lot of fear in our men today that's not having been identified. They're not willing to identify themselves.
I want to add some questions that I hear have to be tackled in almost every session when I'm working with men, whether he's a husband in a couple relationship, or whether he's a father in a single parent relationship, or whether he's a foster parent or has adopted children. And so the questions that I hear are, who values you in your life? Who treasures you? Who has treasured you? What kind of man do you want to be? What kind of man do you want your child to see you being? Frequently, I hear that men don't have a dream about that, or they think that whatever their dream is beyond reach. Do you hear your intuition? Do you hear your instinct talking to you to guide you? Or do you just dismiss it and say, that's not workable? That's not workable. So those are the top challenges that I see. The third question I want to tackle today is, what influences or factors are related to fathers experiencing mental and behavioral health challenges? Can you speak about men and their relationships in particular, with the factors and influences related to men experiencing mental and behavioral health? And let me put a point in here. We're using mental health and behavioral health interchangeably, because basically they're the same concept. Some people make a distinction that behavioral health is more superficial, more community-based, more externally oriented, and mental health may be more serious, more organic, more like inherited kinds of issues. But basically, those two words are synonymous, so you'll hear us using both of those interchangeably. But gentlemen, could you talk about what influences or factors are related to fathers experiencing mental and behavioral health challenges?
Go, Matt.
Go, Mac. Well, I think it's extremely frightening to have the first baby, because then a man has to grow up and all of the messages have to kind of flow out, and he needs to get with it. So talk about anxiety, the anxiety of fatherhood, which I think is in general what we're speaking to in the whole conference. It's frightening to think that you've got to provide for a child, materially, emotionally, spiritually, physically, that you're supposed to have answers to child rearing. And I think young fathers very often don't have a male model that has shown them how to be a father. So they're working in an abyss. And if you're a man that thinks you're supposed to have an answer to everything, a new baby just puts you right in the middle of a crisis of not knowing what to do or what to say or how to be. So I think the anxiety levels are huge at the birth of a first child. Subsequently, I think either men run away from it altogether because they're so afraid of the role, or they very often get depressed because they don't know what to do and they feel so inept at fatherhood that they take that internally and get very depressed by it and don't seek the help and support they need from other men in the community or mental health counselors. So I think fathers do postpartum depression equally with women, but fathers never acknowledge that as truly a problem for them. So anxiety is the big issue, I think, that men have to deal with.
If I can build off of what Mac just talked about there, I think also when we talk about the challenges that relate to fathers experiencing mental health or behavioral challenges, it has to do with a recognition that, we talk about, Mac talked about kind of postpartum depression, and we know that women have postpartum depression, but we don't oftentimes talk about the fact that sometimes men have postpartum depression too, and what that all means. But I also think that there's this issue that shows up as relates to fathers. And when we think about fathers, we like to think of fathers kind of from a more global perspective, a broader perspective. He is a financial provider. He's a protector. He's also a source of emotional concern. But when we distill what people kind of actually go to, they go to either the protector or the financial provider buckets. And we don't give men access, I'll use that word, to the kind of wide array of experiences that men and fathers have to kind of actually embody, and there are ways in which men sometimes, I think, struggle with how to kind of meet the demands. What do I do when my daughter is crying or my son is crying and I have to kind of actually provide emotional support to that child? Because it's uncomfortable for me. What do I do with that? How do I make sense of that? Especially if I feel as if I don't have the skills to actually live into that. Or better yet, what if I am a bit self-critical in thinking about how effective I was in managing whatever incident that just occurred with my child? The joke that I like to make with most parents is that before I had children, I thought I was a patient person. And then I became a parent and I realized I'm not a patient person at all, and so it's one of those things where when I say that to folks, they then begin to laugh because they're just like, oh my God, I thought it was only me, and a recognition that each of us, yes, there are things that kind of gets us there faster than others, but thinking about how do we normalize these experiences and recognize that, these are things that are important. And I think that these are the ways in which that men's behavioral health challenges come up, because if I'm supposed to be able to solve this for myself, and I don't know that, the challenges that I'm encountering are common and normal, and I might begin to kind of either act it out or internalize it and not know how best to deal with it. So I think these are some of the issues that show up as I think about the work and I think about that question that you raised, Dr. Stevenson.
Yes, and I might add to both points, very valid points. And I would go to the origin of this idea about men and their behavior, is that how a man sees himself, how I behave in the beginning is what I bring to any relationship. Whether it be fatherhood, whether that is, that's what I bring initially. I've been having self-sabotaging behavior, bringing that to my relationship. I'm bringing that to my fatherhood demonstration. So the idea is the fact that knowing that how you see yourself and the relationship you have with yourself is not displaced of how you have a relationship in your life in general. And so working with men to re-identify how they see themselves, I think is a very important factor to have them be able to address any type of change and to accommodate any type of level of change on the idea that, yes, I'm going to re-identify, not be in denial about my behavior and what I bring into my relationship. It starts with me and how I see myself. And so therefore, if we start there, then it'll be an easier transition, talk about other identifiable responsibilities as fatherhood, as being a mate, all those other things, to re-identify those things from the beginning. I think it'll be a greater and easier transition to recognize the level of whatever is required for me to learn how to be a better father. That is how I define that. There's not a perfect book out to say, if you just read this, you'll be the great father. That's not our reality. So it's also knowing that it's an ongoing learning experience. Be open to that.
You know, the other piece that I oftentimes think about too is this idea of the expectations from those who are most around us. And so kind of recognizing that, you know, in our role as fathers, we like to think about us embodying the role, but the reality is people also reinforce that us in that role also, and kind of recognizing that there are ways in which, you know, our social network welcomes us into that role and then reinforces us in that role. You know, so you know, the joke that I use sometimes is that, you know, when you're at work and you say, oh, I need to leave to do blah 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 for my child, no, people say, oh yeah, go right ahead, do that, you know, if you have the flexibility with that. There's a way in which even in that little exchange, world is saying we recognize that you have a status that is actually important and needs to be affirmed. What if that's not affirmed? What does that then do for us, and how does that then impact us in our functioning? I think becomes really, really critical. So I think that there's also a way in which we oftentimes don't think about how not only do the people around us, but the kids that we are actually trying to raise actually also play a role in how we understand ourselves as a parent, you know? And so these things become really, really critical and important for us to be mindful of.
I want to add two points to what we said already. One is that we're talking about the internal dialogue that the man is having, him with him, that he's not present to, but it's a strong influence. And all the messages that we're talking about are messages that he reacts to without realizing that he's reacting to them. But the other thing that's important to pay attention to is that what he concludes about that internal dialogue, it's only me, I'm the only one, no one else can hear me, no one else struggles with this but me, I can't tell anyone. Then there's the issue of the woman in his life, and the perception that she has of him is a strong influence or factor relating to fathers experiencing mental and behavioral health issues. If we women are disrespectful, if we women are denigrating, if we women are not acknowledging their efforts, if we put men down, and we're notorious for that. Some of the stereotypes and myths that we're raised in when we're girls, listen to our mothers and grandmothers and aunts and the ladies at the bridge club. And if you got this Jack and Jill meetings and wherever it is, church meetings, you hear women get together and discuss men in the presence of girls. And then we take those untested, unverified stereotypes to our relationships and just wait for the guy, whatever his age is, to confirm those thoughts that we have. And then we don't know why they get upset with us, because we're not hard to deal with. We're not complicated. I don't know why you're having a problem. It must be you. It's not me. So those are something else that I think are factors that influence. So the next question that we're going to tackle is, how do men interview a therapist to make sure that the therapist is a good fit? And I'll start us by saying, I tell clients all the time, picking a therapist is more important than buying a pair of shoes. We hardly ever buy the first pair of shoes we try on. So you do want to make sure that their style, their personality, how they work fits with who you are. So, gentlemen, how would you like to tackle that? Jerome, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yes, give thanks. Yes, so in my population I deal with predominantly is that my men interview me as if I'm part of the legal system. That I am part of the punitive part of the system while they're there. I feel that energy, and it's somewhat as obvious because they're coming out of incarceration or jail, and they would have that idea that they're referred to someone of a punitive measure. a lot of that, I work through that in terms of as they're interviewing me as a therapist, that I walk through that and build that rapport and make the distinction that I'm not part of that process. I'm part of the process of healing and wellness, non-judgmental. I'm here to meet you right where you are, and we can have an open conversation about what that looks like. But I find that that's a part that they've already come in prejudging us, and have compartmentalized us and what their expectations are. And so that I find that in this process of how they interview me and what their expectations are, I find that I welcome that. I think this is a part of how I can educate them, process of way to look at, why am I here? I'm here because I'm mandated only to move through the mandate, in my case, through how this is going to be educational and transforming for you.
Kind of picking up from what Dr. Mosby just said, I usually ask folks to ask themselves a basic question when they're sitting with me, which is he someone I can work with? As a way of kind of basically, ask yourself, can you work with me? And the question about can you work with me should also, I think, take go one step further and saying, if the answer is no, I want you to be able to come back around to me and tell me that you don't think that I would be a good fit for you, but I should have enough, and I'm going to use a psychological term here, I should have enough ego strength to be able to help you find someone who you might feel you can more connect to. And so I think it's a challenging dance that we as clinicians need to be doing, but we need to be able to sit with folks saying to us, you're a nice person, no knock against you, but I don't know that you're the one for me. And us saying, okay, that's fair. Let's now think about how we move forward. So that's a question that I usually ask.
So just to add to that, most of the men that I see come via referral. So I've kind of graduated from the mandated person into they come by referral from other men that I've seen, which is very helpful in the assessment process because there's a level of trust just to begin with. And then I make a real effort to try to go where men are, to sporting events and church events and other activities, and consider that really a part of the assessment process, that they're not sitting down with a mental health counselor. They're just kind of having a conversation with a guy, and they realize that maybe they could have other deeper conversations with me. And so I see that sort of as an essential ingredient to the assessment process, letting them assess me without having kind of this fixed relationship necessarily.
That's a great point about us as showing some level of vulnerability, however, with boundaries, of course. Mm-hmm. But I do think that the fact that we show ourselves relatable, I think is major in how they assess us, and it's that first impression is major. That both points that are made here. I do think that as long as we allow ourselves to trust that we have the ability to be relatable and demonstrate our relatability, I think certainly a lot of barriers in that manner.
I've had the experience recently of having a new avenue to support men feeling safe and comfortable when they're coming in to work with a woman, with all of the entanglements that might involve. And that is my gray hair. Because I have men saying, I was working with a group of men who were in addiction recovery. And I was asking them one day, why do they laugh so much in the sessions? I use humor, but why were they laughing? And they said, Doc, you really want us to tell you? Yeah, I do. They said, you sound like my grandmother. I can't even tell you how much you sound like my grandmother. And that makes me smile and feel okay. So I said, thank you, grandmother. I appreciate it. Okay. The next question is, what is the gender paradox in suicidal behavior and its impact on the suicidal process for men and women? And as you're contemplating that question, the gender paradox, if you could identify how different genders cope with the experience of wanting to give up completely and die and lose all hope.
Yeah.
Can you speak about the gender paradox and its impact on the suicidal process?
Well, just one sentence to the paradox. Women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression, and men die of suicide 3 times more often than women do.
That's really deep.
Yeah.
I mean, do we have any, other than the things we've already been talking about, where men aren't socialized to those softer emotions, men aren't encouraged to even have the vocabulary for those softer emotions? Do you think that those kinds of things we've already been talking about can contribute to that vast break?
Yes, particularly as we mentioned earlier about the idea that men are supposed to be the protector, supposed to be the provider, and all those in the other areas. And so if a man is seeing himself not in that realm of doing any of those things consistently, can certainly have a feeding mechanism towards the actual. So if I'm not attaining those different aspects of how men are supposed to be, that I certainly can be impressed upon, and in that the way that thinking in the laboratory way of thinking certainly can lead to those thoughts.
One of the things that I think about is, something that the research shows, that while women are more diagnosed with depression, and men are more likely to complete the suicide gesture actions. One of the factors that play a role in that is the ways in which men go about ending their lives. Women, the research shows that men are more likely to use more lethal forms to actually end their lives. So when you shoot yourself in the head with a gun, rarely is one able to kind of pull back from that, and so kind of thinking about the ways in which, and what that raises for me is this question about how men are socialized into being men, and the kind of actions that they engage in, and so if I am going to pick up a gun to end my life versus drinking some pills, there are ways in which one can intervene differently in those contexts. And I think that this is another way in which, if we look at the VA system, for example, where, we see a large number of military men who are actually engaging in suicidal behavior, these men have, training around that. And so just thinking about what it means for us around how we not only ask the question about are men thinking about harming themselves, but also assessing means, i.e., how they're going to do it and whether or not they have access to those means, and then putting a plan in place that recognizes that, if there's a gun in the house, how we need to secure those things as a way of kind of keeping men safe, and not, and I'm going to maybe touch the third rail by saying this, and not limiting their constitutional right to kind of bear arms, and what all that brings up for folks.
I agree. And the other element too to this is social media. And what I mean by that is we see violence bombarded on the television. We see violence bombarded in our social settings frequently, often. And so therefore, if men are watching this violent behavior, they're seeing other things that promote violent behavior. This idea about the quick access to be able to do certain things in terms of ending your life, or that violence is if you don't measure up, then this is the things that happen. So I believe that there are aspects of the media, social media, that are sending subliminal messages that are being taken on as well in terms of how I feel about myself. If I'm not doing this, then I don't matter, don't count, and I'm a disappointment. All these things that narrative that develops also in those influences.
I'm going to take us down a rabbit hole, and I don't want to go down too long, but I do want to go down far, deep, quickly, because the issue of trauma is paramount in this conversation. we have men and women, but particularly men because they're more silent about it, who were traumatized as early as 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old. The amount of sex abuse that we don't know about because men don't report, women are more likely to, girls are more likely to report it. But the point of the trauma conversation is that the core of trauma at its most intense is powerlessness and helplessness. And so if I have a toddler or elementary age kid who is already feeling powerless and helpless with no outlet and no rescue, and they keep growing, the suicidal thought is embedded in their everyday walk. There's no point in my life. I'm already a hot mess. I don't even need to be here. Nobody loves me anyway. Nobody likes me. I'm responsible for that. I worked with a man one time who was in prison for rape, but his backstory was that when he was growing up, his mother's boyfriend was an addict, and he kept jumping into the boy's bed to sodomize him at night. And he would come in, put his hand over the boy's mouth, and then do what he did and tell him, if you tell anybody, I'm going to kill your mother. I'm going to kill your mother. And he was terrified of that. He grew up thinking he was better than his mother in pleasing men. And that led to all the fallout from that. And every day his life was marked by, I might as well be dead. It doesn't matter if I live or die. I could just as easily be dead. And when I talked with him, I had about 2 years to talk with him in prison. We got to the little boy who was absolutely terrified. And he said, he wasn't going to kill my mother. I don't know if he was or wasn't. What I do know is that nobody was saying you were in competition or your mother was in competition with you for the love of a man. You just wanted a father. And you wanted the man to like you. And he was a little boy. Every day he was willing to die. I think we really have to pay attention to that because the coping skills for that are mostly avoidance. People avoid it by using drugs, by gambling, by random sex, by getting addicted to adrenaline bursts when you do crime, all kinds of ways to simply verify that you're alive.
Great point.
The last question that I want to talk about, what are the three things that we, as human service practitioners and therapists, and also therapists who treat fathers a lot, what are the three things that we can do to help fathers who are at risk or are struggling with mental health and substance abuse disorders? And I'm gonna open this one. Because one of my pet peeves in this field is that people take substance abuse disorders as a separate category for intervention. And when you look at the backstory for that person who is an addict, whether it's alcohol or pills or whatever it may be, shopping, whatever it may be, odds are there was a day before that first use. And on that day before that first use, their life was a hot mess. It was filled with so much unwanted emotion and so many unwanted thoughts that they were willing to do anything to stop that feeling. And so something that they knew was self-destructive is perfectly acceptable if it will stop it. So substance abuse is a coping mechanism for depression, for anxiety, and for trauma. It's a coping mechanism for an unacceptable life that you're powerless to do anything about. So we have to link those two. They are co-occurring diagnoses, but they are integrated diagnoses. And if we treat the use without treating the onset, we're just setting up relapse. So what are three things that we can do to help?
One of the things that came first to mind in discussion was to dispel the myths about therapy, about the work, about any level of intervention, whether it be substance abuse or whatever, mental health, whatever it is. It's a lot of times that men won't show up because of those myths. Those myths about the advantage of one seeking help is very important. And so to give another definition of what we really do across the board is very important. Also talking about their ability to change, about self-empowerment, about wellness, about the other option, about what they're currently experiencing. So to talk about those things, open the portal of thought about the possibilities to change. Also, as we agree on that, we certainly find the necessary resources that fit that particular person.
Derek, Mac?
When I think about this question, I like to begin, I go from concrete to kind of a little bit more heady. So, and I agree with everything that's been said before. The thing that resonates for me is a recognition that men do have mental health needs as a basic. We need to kind of recognize that there are needs that mental health needs that men have, and that should be acknowledged. The other thing I think about is that how do we create resources for men that meets them where they're at, in the communities that they're at, in the families that they're at, in the cultures that they're at, and kind of recognizing how we kind of work through that and kind of build there. And then, and then asking the question around the communities that folks might come from, are there unique, I use that word kind of loosely, but are there unique factors that we need to be thinking about for specific communities? For example, for men of color, what are the additional barriers that are there? What it might mean as you enter this therapeutic space where all of the therapists that you have access to don't look or reflect you culturally. What kind of barrier does that generate, and how do we think about that? And how do we as clinicians, I say it that way, sit in the space where when folks raise these as concerns, we can acknowledge that those differences that are there, and how do we work towards meeting those things? And so these are three areas that I think should definitely be thought of.
So I agree with you. I think we've got to acknowledge the distance that exists between us and the men that we work with. And I think that takes a great measure of humility. We have to meet the fathers where they are, and are being an existential existence, not just a place. But, I think it's really important to humbly acknowledge that I will never know what it means to be an African American male in America. And if I say that up front and say, now what is our conversation? Instead of making a presumption that I know what it's like when I don't, or I don't have any understanding of a person practicing their Hindu faith. If we talk about that at the beginning, and as we said at the very beginning of this session, work very hard to not be judgmental and not have stereotypes and not put anybody in any kind of a box, and deal with our own struggle to be connected. I think that goes a long way to making therapy possible. If people are going to consider themselves to be judged or condemned or ridiculed or put in a box, they're not going to come to therapy. So our job is to be very open and ultimately be great listeners that will accept anybody and everyone wherever they're coming from with whatever baggage they've got.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panel. I would add one point to where we are now. I started my career 900 years ago doing talk shows on television. And it was one of the first times that mental health providers, not to mention minority mental health providers, were on talk shows talking about mental health issues in the community with the general public. And I still have people who see my face, it doesn't look the same, is when I was doing that. But for me, that was one of the things that I did to get messages out there to people who might not hear it, doing things like we're doing in this panel, who might not normally meet us. We come from all over the country, makes a big difference. I want to thank everybody for participating in this. For me personally, this was a rich conversation. And I hope we get a chance to continue it further. We could take each of the topics that we've talked about today and do full days on each of the topics. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's a possibility somebody will get that idea and they'll do a once a month, break this down into 12 different topics. I'm just saying it's a thought. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A section next.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Who you have before you are the members of the panel that you just witnessed. We hope you enjoyed it. We have a lot of questions. We're going to get right to them. I'm Dr. Stevenson. With me is Dr. Maltby and Max Hamlet. The first question is, what is the history behind why there is so little research on the mental health of fathers that needs to be said to see what the barriers and how we manage to lessen those barriers? So one of the reasons that I understand why there's so little so little research on the mental health of fathers is that the men who dominated the field at an early time were the ones who would have done the research, and they were much more interested in what women were doing than they were in what men were doing, because they really didn't want men to be seen as too vulnerable or too far from the stereotype. But what occurred in time was the fathers' rights movements that occurred in our country. Some of the women's movement issues rolled over into fathers and men's issues, and family therapy and family systems therapy really changed the field of mental health care. So men became more prominent, men became more noticeable, and then as minority providers increased, and more minority professionals got educated into the arena of relationships, work on men became even more prominent. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that. That would be a no. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Great answer.
Good.
Great answer.
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah, but the other thing that impacted the research on males and fathers in general was male on male crime, black on black crime, gay on gay crime. After a while, that became such a prominent part of the forensic world that the people needed to do more research because they needed answers to guide treatment and interventions. And then gradually, fathers' rights became more prominent in the research field. So the next question that we want to tackle is, this would be to Mac. Do fathers feel valued in society, and how do we advance training for therapists working with fathers?
So I've been in practice for quite a while, and have certainly seen a major shift in the status of fathers over 30 years. So when I started, fathers didn't come at all to therapy unless they were sent or ordered. And now, after a few decades, I am getting fathers that are seeking out therapy. I've also experienced that in the court system. At one time, decades ago, fathers were not valued as a nurturing entity. They were only valued as a material provider for their family. But I'd say in the last 10 years, there's been a major shift of understanding of how essential the man is to the development of a whole person. So we need that masculine energy as much as feminine energy. There seems to be a greater appreciation for that. I just hope more and more the value of men and Father's Day gets raised up in our society as a whole, that we see how important a male influence is on stability and socialization and the full development of a person.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Maltby, how do you develop a trusting relationship with men?
Uh, that's a great question, because it's really difficult depending on the circumstances in that situation. But mostly is to show a little sign of your own vulnerability and showing some connection of the male experience. What I found, one, and also to just really just kind of do those probing questions and ask more about them, what their thoughts are, what their feelings are, and start to address who they are, where they come from, and really let them know that you're really interested in who they are, right? And have that conversation about in details about who they are and what their life experiences was, and try to allow them to be comfortable. And rapport building is so important in that building trust. And so you have to be very strategic to know as much about the person that you can prior to the meeting, and to use those and use strategies around those areas of what you've learned, and also the type of probing questions that you'll ask to help you identify what their thoughts are, what their feelings are, where they come from, and also what their expectations are. So to do that is just really find yourself showing yourself interested in the person, and not as a client, but as a person, as a human being.
Okay, thank you. The next question I'm going to tackle is research to services a primary issue as well. I know mental health services are not very accessible, and then once an individual or an institution is free, it's not the root cause. So access to services is a problem across the world for mental health services. There'll never be enough providers for mental health services. People have gotten to be quite creative lately, and so in many of the major cities, if you pay attention, you'll see men's activities increasing in general. For example, in Chicago, Dr. Obari Cartman has a whole movement of men's services in Southside in Chicago. He does drumming, they do men's yoga, and these are all community-based services that anybody can participate in, and they are all family-oriented and they're men-targeted. There's a program in Baltimore, the Center for Urban Families. It started by Joe James a long time ago, early in my career. I remember when Joe was starting that. And it started as a father's rights movement and an advocacy program to support fathers who were trying to keep visitation with their children and trying to have a leg to stand on when they went to court to set up visitation schedules. And it grew from that into this really large program that now does parenting classes, they do premarital classes, they do marriage maintenance classes, and they have an array of support services. And I'm pretty sure if you check in your city, Washington, D.C. has Bruce Purnell, who is another Black male psychologist, and he has a network of programs that he's doing in D.C. The Campaign for Black Male Achievement has men mentoring programs all over the country. So there are other ways to access services. And that Campaign for Black Male Achievement has services in about 39 cities to allow people to access services, men in particular, and then make their way into mental health services. But there are also other ways to access services that I think people don't pay attention to. Jason Wilson has an amazing page on Instagram and Facebook that is an offshoot of the martial arts program that he has in Detroit. And he's written 2 or 3 books now about the struggle to be a man in a world with women in it and relationships in it and all of the stereotypes and biases that men have to battle. And his position, I'm really not stating this well at all, but his position is that men need to get to know and trust the softer side of themselves and allow themselves to experience those gentle emotions that are also a significant part of who they are. So access to services is a primary problem. Many therapist practices are full. Sometimes it's okay to go on a waiting list. Ask your friends if they've gone to therapy. You'd be surprised how many have. I know my practice has been full for the last 30 years, and I'm not joking about that. My practice has been full, and I'm not the only one. If these guys told you how much work they're doing, you'd say, no wonder we can't get in. We really have to be patient and wait, or keep trying until you find the person who's sitting there waiting for you. The next question. What resources and strategies can you share about mental health and involvement of teen fathers with their children, as well as with programming meant to support them? Mac.
Well, what I've grown to learn is that all of us really are in the second line. So, a lot of my practice and yours too, I'm sure, it comes by referral. So then the question is, who is at the front line? And in the front line, people are the coaches of all the sports. America's a great sports country. And there are adults that are interacting with young men constantly, and you have to have some sort of a network to develop with the community that you're living in. So coaches, pediatricians, principals, teachers. Those people are really seeing men face to face and then referring to us. So I think the mental health community needs to quit thinking just direct one-on-one services, but kind of realize that we're in a network, a huge network of mental health care, and we need to participate in that wider network, because we're receiving referrals that direction. I don't know if I'm answering that question.
You did fine. Okay, next question. We have been working to get boys and men to be vulnerable, share their emotions. Should we, or how do we need to begin to help our partners understand and embrace this? Okay, so being the only woman on this panel, I got this question. It is important. It is important to work with women around our biases. We need to work with women around our stereotyping and our believing myths. All of us grew up listening to our grandmothers, our aunts, the neighbor women at Jack and Jill meetings, women at Bridge Club meetings, women at church group meetings, talking about men, not always in the most complimentary ways, and not including information on how to recover from the hurt, or how to recover from the feeling of betrayal, or how do we give our men a 12th or 50th chance to be who they say they want to be. Those numbers were deliberate because sometimes we got to keep forgiving, and they got to keep forgiving us. We don't always teach our women how to heal from that hurt, and we don't always teach forgiveness at all. Even though we all say we're Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or whatever it is that we're practicing, we don't always practice it with our partners. And as women, we get to be responsible for that. I personally get tired of hearing women describe the man in their house as the one more child that they have to raise. A, that's really disrespectful. And B, it's not but so true. Okay, that was my bias came out just then. But we also have this now component of girl dads, which is a whole nother element in this conversation. As dads stay home and they raise their daughters and they treasure their daughters and they teach their daughters that they're valuable and that they're unique and that I'm your first love and I'm going to set the standard for everybody that comes behind me. As girls experience that space with dads, they then go out into the world. And when boys act a fool or act like they ain't got good sense or they're completely hormone driven, girls are like, I ain't got to put up with that. My daddy raised me better than that. I'm going to be going over here and find somebody that got some sense. And we don't settle for silliness from our boys, from the boys in our lives, especially when we're in our teens. We have to understand that the girls are just as driven by lust as the boys are. And we don't always teach the girls that. We frequently teach the girls that, you know, you got sense, but they don't. So you just you forgive them and keep going without ever teaching them how to forgive. So there's a lot of work on both sides of that equation and that relationship. We as therapists need to remember that when we're doing couples work. I'm saying it humorously because that's the easiest way to say it. But these are really death-defying elements in a relationship. They can kill a relationship, not just the one, but everyone that follows.
Yes.
So next question.
Just real quick, I want to add to that, Dr. Stevens, that, you know, it's very important that women seek to get the counseling, even though I deal with that with domestic violence when there's a male perpetrator, right? That obviously is one who's sent to a program, but not also we have to realize that even the victim needs some intervention as well. And so these emasculations of men, all these things, They don't realize that they also, maybe not intentionally, but they're also the provocators that, they actually provoke such situations, not maybe realizing it. So I think that women need just as much intervention, even though they might be the victim in certain cases, to offset what they may think.
All right. So my one word wrap up sentence is listening is an art. It takes a lifetime to learn how to artfully listen, and men desperately need to be heard.
And I will also include that men, we have to get in touch with our feelings. We have to get away from this macho standard of tough it out, suck it up, and I'm not going to feel what I really feel. I'm not going to demonstrate what I feel. I'm just going to mask my true inner thoughts and my true inner feelings. So we have to be more vulnerable and really get to understand that we hurt too. And in that hurt, things arise, and we have to have the capacity to recognize that we don't need to suppress it. We actually need to deal with it.